Welcome back, everyone, to Todd's podcast. We have another installment of Generally Speaking, and we've got an old-timey regular with us, General Jake Polumbo, who's been on here a couple of times, and the newest member of Two Blue Aces, Executive Leadership and Consulting, Major General Kurt Neubauer. Nubes is a 34-year decorated veteran of the United States Air Force, all active duty. Retired in 2015. Is that when you retired, Jake? 15, or did you do 16?
We retired about the same time, really within months of each other. So
Nubes earned the rank of Major General, 2 stars. He graduated from the Air Force Academy and graduated with our other guest, Jake, at the same time back in the day. What was your major back then, Jake?
I majored in engineering mechanics.
Okay, all right. He flew more than 4,000 flight hours, including 500 combat hours. He primarily flew the F-16 fighter, but he also piloted the U-2, the AC-130, the B-52. Did you pilot that, or were you on the crew?
I was in the crew on the B-52.
Okay.
They didn't trust me at the controls of that airplane.
After dinner last night, I'm not sure I would disagree with him, and also the C-117. So you've flown heavies and you've flown fast jets, so bring a great breadth of knowledge here. Many major awards and decorations that, if you'd like to know more about Nubes, please go on to the Two Blue Aces website, and you could look up his bio, because we would take up a whole hour going through his resume and what all he's flown and what all he's accomplished. In the Air Force, he was the United States Air Force Chief of Safety, which directed the worldwide operational risk management and the nuclear policy for over 690,000 airmen. Currently, you are chair on the board of Revolves Foundation. Did I say that correct? Reveille Foundation, which is a not-for-profit that provides career counseling and education assistance to veterans who are transitioning away from active duty and into their private lives. Is that correct?
Correct.
He has a wife of 38 years, Sandy. They live in the Phoenix area, have 2 children and 4 grandchildren. How did I do with the introduction? Okay.
That's perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Before we get started, I want to thank you all for having me over for dinner last night and hosting me. It was lively discussion. I found out a lot. I kind of had a script going into this. I made a few additional changes after we talked last night, just because you gave me some insight that I didn't have. But I would like to come in and start talking about a few things that I think hopefully will be pretty interesting. And Nubes, we'll start with you. We mentioned that you were in charge. You were the Air Force Chief of Safety worldwide for the entire United States Air Force, correct?
That's correct, yeah.
Tell us what that entailed. I mean, for the whole world, that's got to be a pretty significant challenge.
It's an interesting position to be put in because you're dual-hatted. And what I mean by that is you have 2 sets of responsibilities, one of which is to be part of the Air Force staff within the Pentagon. So my direct report was the Chief of Staff, and I would have a direct conduit to that boss. And then
Air Force Chief of Staff?
Air Force Chief of Staff, yeah. And then I was also given command of the Air Force Safety Center, which is in Albuquerque, New Mexico at Kirtland Air Force Base. So I would actually split my time, I'd say probably 80-20. Most of the time was in the Pentagon, but about 20 to maybe 25% of my time was traveling out to the center and getting a sense of what the people in that particular organization were doing, and I'll explain that right here, right now. It's about 200 people. It's a mixed bag of active duty, guard and reserve officers and enlisted, and general schedule civilian employees that work for the Department of Defense. And each of them has a particular specialty that is either aligned with aviation safety or we called it ground safety at the time, but now it's occupational safety, handling of weapons and ordnance. And then the last piece was the nuclear surety or nuclear policy types of things, with some other specialties that were embedded in the organization. In other words, how to accomplish the forensics on a safety or a mishap investigation, or to track human factors, personality traits, how people adapt to different training types and situations and whatnot. So it's really interesting. And I would say the biggest draw and why I feel so fortunate to have had that job is because you get to see the whole picture of the Air Force. For much of my career, I was very isolated, primarily in line flying organizations. As a pilot, which was, and I'm not complaining, it was great, but it limits you from getting the insights of, okay, what are the motivating factors? What are the issues and challenges that other airmen, and when I say airmen, I mean big A airmen, officer and enlisted and civilian employees, what are they dealing with in their specialties? And then how do you provide some connective tissue across those specialties so you can unify the effort for whatever organizational level you're working in order to better accomplish whatever that mission is, whether it's flying airplanes or fixing airplanes or keeping people healthy or keeping people physically fit or those kinds of things. So it was a great opportunity. The last thing I'll say about the safety center / director of safety for the Air Force position is I was given the privilege of being able to travel pretty much worldwide to go get some on-site observation of how policy affected organizations that were actually out doing the mission, whether it was a training outfit or it was a deployed outfit in the Middle East, or perhaps a more of an isolated unit that had a very specialized mission. Say, for example, how do you assemble general purpose bombs? And that's their complete reason for being. But how does the policy that the headquarters translate down to that level at the execution level? And then what lessons can you take back to the headquarters based on feedback from the people that are actually doing the job to get a sense of, is this directive or is this policy, does this even make sense? Is it relevant today based on how rapidly things are changing or how
integrated into their systems?
Exactly. And you can
long
learn.
as Kurt, as long as we didn't have a major accident anywhere in the Air Force, Kurt had the best job in the Air Force because he could go anywhere. He could visit any unit. He could meet all the airmen that were doing great things around the world. And an example of that was when I was at Shaw in my final position, Todd, where you visited. Kurt and his wife came to visit us, and we flew F-16s together. We just jumped in a couple airplanes, and we went flying.
Just like that,
because Kurt was the commander of the safety center, and he needed to be out in the field seeing what was going on. So as long as we didn't have anything go wrong, Kurt, you had the best job in the Air Force.
It was a great job. I have to admit that I was a little bit envious of my buddy Jake for being a numbered Air Force commander, because that was the next goal that I wanted to be able to reach. But by the same token, the breadth of touch points that I was given in the safety position is, to me, is irreplaceable. Now, the other thing I'll tell you about that visit to Shaw when Jake and I flew together, that was not, I don't want to give the impression that the only reason we went down there was so Jake and I could tell lies about how great we were and then talk with our hands at the officers club later on in the day. It was also for me to be able to observe and those touch points that I talked about earlier, and and he gave me a wonderful opportunity to talk to a room full of pilots as well, to try to to try to get kind of a mental picture or a mindset from an old guy like myself to the younger pilots who are just full of, energy and tenacity and passion for what they're doing, and to both give them a pep talk and then also to say, okay, guys, there's a light at the end of the tunnel too, and try to convince them that they someday want to have his job that he had, or my job,
Right.
because the service needs that operational depth at the headquarters management policy level in order to raise the bar for the organization gradually over time, incorporating the lessons that they learn just by experience.
And how long did you do? Was that like a 2-year?
That was that was a 2-year.
Was that at the end of your
and that was
career?
the last position I held in the Air Force.
So you made recommendations, you brought back things. How was there reluctance or general acceptance of what you brought in? Were you fighting headwinds? Were you fighting the old guard? And, hey, we've never done it that way. Why are you making changes? I mean, I think what I read is you had great success.
Not a bit. I had tremendous support from General Mark Welsh, who was the Chief of Staff at the time, and I would go so far as to say that, not that I was down in his office weekly or monthly or anything like that, but I had a direct conduit to the leader of the service, essentially, and I could give him my honest assessment of what I observed at, let's say, Shaw Air Force Base or Beale Air Force Base or Luke Air Force Base or whatnot, and be able to tell him directly, these are the things that I saw, and it would be helpful if you would include comments related to, hey, we're in a risk business, we're aware of the risk, we take it on voluntarily and enthusiastically, but we want to minimize the amount of risk that we take regardless of what kind of operation we're doing. And if you've never heard him speak, it's worth listening to, because he's got a way of connecting with the audience at a visceral, personal level, unlike anybody I've ever seen. And for him to essentially agree enthusiastically, like, yeah, Nubes, I'll do that, and go out and do it, it provided a tremendous amount of success, at least for that 2-year block, because the Air Force had just come off a series of pretty serious mishaps prior to me going in. And I think by virtue of General Welsh getting out and circulating like he did in his position and talking about those things, and then like my buddy Jake doing it at his level, and certainly in the position that I was, I'm obliged to talk about risk mitigation. And that actually lowered the mishap rate, both for aviation and ground related safety instances to the lowest in the Air Force history. Now, I don't know what the mishap rates are these days, but I'm convinced that if not the biggest reason, a huge part of that is directly related to his messaging and his ability to connect with the force.
He's now the president of Texas A&M University, and all the students there love him.
How could they not
flock to his sessions? Session with the president, listen to the presidents. But what Kurt's talking about mishaps, Todd, we've had a lot of, obviously, aviation crashes, aviation fires in recent months here in the U.S. And when the bad stuff happened in the Air Force, the first thing that the commander of the whole Air Force would do would be to call Nubes in the office, and then the system would kick in. Okay, go to this location, put somebody senior in charge of the investigation, and I'll give you 30 days to figure out what happened, and then report back to me.
And one of the caveats I want to bring up to what Jake is talking about that 30-day egg timer, that's to find out root causes of what transpired that put that airman and that piece of equipment into that situation where the mishap actually happened. It's not to associate blame. It's not to associate accountability. It's just to find out what happened, how did it happen, why did it happen, and then provide recommendations to prevent that from happening again, whether it's a policy or a training or a proficiency issue. That was the outgrowth of that Safety Investigation Board, or SIB. After that, there's another investigation that looks through the same data that's collected by the Safety Investigation Board. And that one is basically an accountability board. That's an accident investigation board, and that, or AIB, and that separate investigation takes the same data, looks at it again, and then determines, is it a manufacturing issue? Is it a maintenance issue? Is it a human factors issue? Is it a complacency issue? And then go from there. The Air Force, the way it does mishap investigations is there's a thing called safety privilege. And the safety privileged information are those things that could point to accountability.
Liability.
Or liability. Thanks for that, Jake. And those facts are fenced off during the Safety Investigation Board just to focus on the root cause of the mishap and get to the bottom of what transpired and what happened and how do we fix it. So it's a very rigorous process. It's not just a single officer that goes and does either one of those investigations. There are handpicked people from different specialties. If it's an aviation mishap, they'll get an aviator involved. Those kinds of things. So there's subject matter expertise that's embedded in the investigation.
Todd's podcast is sponsored in part by Saunders Real Estate, your trusted partner in land and commercial real estate since 1996. With over 125 expert advisors located throughout the Southeast United States, the full-service brokerage specializes in a wide range of property types from farms and ranches to commercial buildings and development land. If you're looking to build your legacy with a confident investment, please visit saundersrealestate.com or call 877-518-5263 to connect with an advisor today. So being around you guys casually and on the radio, on the podcast and at dinner or whatever, there's always a conversation about risk, even if it's just casual. It's something that y'all live with. I'm sure you had to be exposed. Hey, this is your risk for every mission. And we had dinner with General Martin and his wife Julia last week. And we were talking about the upcoming episode, and he said, ask Nubes about the difference between wartime safety protocols and peacetime training protocols and the importance of following those strict protocols. He said you would be the person to ask.
What I would say about that is they're similar skills and requirements that translate from training to combat operations. You have to build a foundation of what I used to call brilliance in the basics in order to be able to consistently, repeatedly, efficiently, and effectively accomplish whatever the task was. Along with that type of building block or concentration focus on fundamentals, there are things that we use called training rules that are very specific for the particular mission that you're involved in, whether it's air intercept or it's visual maneuvering or it's practicing at the bombing range. And they're in place for two reasons. The paramount reason is risk mitigation, essentially. It's a risk business, I mean, you're flying a hunk of metal that's doing 500 miles an hour. It's got 1.5 million parts in it, and you've got a 24-year-old lieutenant at the controls. I mean, if you think of it that way, you need to have those boundaries in order to be able to do all those things, but do them in an efficient, effective, repeatable, and, for lack of a better word, safe way, so that that pilot or that security forces base defender or that aircraft maintainer, they have a set of rules and guidelines that are basically the boundaries of where they can work within. And then embedded within that are the little colloquial lessons learned, personal experiences, this is what works for me, techniques that aid to that process of training, because it's essentially about training your replacement.
Right.
Because we all age out at some point, right? So in training, you've got training rules. In combat, you have rules of engagement.
Right.
Much different. Much different. And part of that has to do with bigger picture things like just war theory, whether or not you're going to escalate. The word escapes me right now, but proportionality.
Yeah.
Things like that aren't, they're kind of a in the background consideration in the training rule codification, if you will, but they're not at the forefront. It's much different when you're downrange because you're dealing with human lives, whether it's it's friend or enemy. All right. I mean, not the biggest, but one of the biggest, I won't go so far as to say fear, but capital C concern for me when I was downrange in Iraq was ensuring that if we were going to drop live ordnance on somebody, we're going to confirm it's somebody who deserves it, and it's not one of my friends in the Army or in the Marine Corps or some direct action team from an unnamed
CIA.
Thank you for that. I was going to say 3-letter agency, but
It starts with a C and ends with an IA.
and we did Overwatch for those kinds of missions, and there were cases where they required air support, but essentially you have to have that confirmation that it's the correct target, and that bomb or that bullet is going to go to the right place. What I'm getting at really is the stakes are so much different and higher,
Right.
in combat than they are in training. In training, the stakes are, they still could be life and death, right? But it's about hurting or killing people or bending metal in training, essentially. In combat, it's not just those things. It's those things also with, are we being ethical and moral about how we're doing this?
So you have to make that decision when you're in the air, or is that decision made before
Those
you go up?
decisions are made for you before you go up. You know, one of the
I
things.
think you have enough to think of when you're up there.
It's
on a
both,
mission.
and we do a lot of training to make sure that our people who have lethal weapons, shoot missiles, drop bombs, shoot guns, that they understand the ramifications of what they're about to do if they pull the trigger. But yeah, I think, Todd, also where Kurt is leading us is to kind of understand that, and well, let's just talk flying. So a lot of people will say flying is dangerous. Flying can be dangerous. Flying can, you take an airplane off and you may not come back. And I always insist to people that are flying with me or that I am part of a flying operation with them is that if flying is dangerous, then I'm not doing it. It's not dangerous. There's risk involved. You know, if your engine quits, you need to land somewhere. It might not be on a runway, it might be in a field. Is that dangerous? No, not if you know what you're doing, if you practiced. So I would tell my pilots, especially the pilots, if you will, that if they allow training to be dangerous, that they're going to lose their pilot license. I'm going to take it away from them.
Right.
Combat is dangerous. Combat flying, combat operations on the ground, at sea is dangerous, and you have to deal with that. But training, I said, do not let danger creep into your training operations, or you won't be doing it tomorrow. And I think that's where the flying public probably is having a little bit of difficulty these days with, you know, is flying safe? And in my view, it is. Flying is one of the safer ways to get around Florida right now.
Absolutely.
It's better than driving in some cases.
Yeah, you mentioned risk. I mean, honestly, just about everyone in the country takes risk every day. Getting into a vehicle
Right.
and driving on the interstate, that's risky, regardless of how much traffic it is, because there's things that could happen that you may not be prepared for. What if you have a blowout? What if you get cut off? What if it to death? So risk is not something that we necessarily, any of us, frankly, shy away from. In your business, you accept risk.
Right.
It's a different category of risk,
Right.
but you still have to accept risk in order to meet the goals of the partnership.
Right.
So I think the caveat or the kicker on all that is being aware of what risk you're exposed to just naturally, and then what measures can you take to preempt either more risk coming your way or to keep the risk that's within that you're just going to just cost a business, regardless of what the business is. How do you keep that at the minimal level so you can meet your objective, whatever your objective is, whether it's to make money or sell real estate or drop bombs on targets?
So now that you've retired, do you do outside consulting for other organizations for risk? Is it just aircraft risk? Is it flight risk? Is it flying pattern risk?
Right now, I'm involved actually with Winter Haven Airport,
Okay.
and as part of Two Blue Aces, which I'm sure Jake will talk about later, I'm there to help the airport director, Troy Heidel, codify procedures for operations of both the land-based runways and the seaplane operation that's just adjacent to the runways in order to provide appropriate procedural guidance, altitude separation, lateral separation of the myriad airplanes, seaplanes, helicopters that fly out of that general vicinity, essentially to mitigate the risk that all those pilots are taking on voluntarily because they're either learning to fly, want to continue to fly, they enjoy flying, whatever the motivation is. You just want to be able to do that in a safe, effective, and efficient way so that everyone can meet their goal. It raises the bar for everybody,
Right.
but it tries to lower the bar for the amount of risk that's inherent in those kinds of operations, because flying is, I don't want to say it's dangerous because I don't think it's dangerous, but let's just say it's a little bit.
Well, let me know after you take off of the seaplane in about an hour and a half or 2
Yeah,
hours.
we're gonna take Kurt up flying this right after your podcast, Todd. Kurt and I are gonna take off out of Bartow. We're gonna fly to Winter Haven. We're gonna taxi to the seaplane base. Then we're gonna jump in 2 seaplanes, not one. Sandy's gonna go with me. Kurt's gonna fly with one of the chief pilots.
My
out.
lovely wife.
Yeah, Sandy
And I want to go on record. I told her this before we came down here from Arizona. that I would only trust Jake to fly her. So,
I
But
thought you loved your wife.
we're gonna do that, and that's gonna give Kurt a better understanding of what Troy Heidel and Ben Ships, who also
Yeah, it'll
runs the
be-
seaplane base,
it'll
he's
be
gonna
fantastic.
It's
I'll
gonna
be able
be
to see it
hands-on experience that he needs to see to help develop these procedures. Because over the next year or two, Winter Havens Airport is going to get more complex
Right.
and more dynamic, and we really need better procedures, and that's what Troy has asked both me, but especially Kurt, to help with.
the combination of both the land-based and the seaplane operations too. This is actually something that's very interesting to be involved in, because it's, at least in my experience, it's an unusual combination. So if Winter Haven can be an example of, okay, this is how it's done, that's a win for the rest of the country. I'm not saying that it's the only airport that's got land and seaplane operations, but it could be the benchmark for the rest of the country with the right codification of procedural
Rules and
rules
procedures and process.
rules of the road
Communication.
is the colloquialism I'll use on that.
So would like a major airport ever call you in to consult? Do they do that periodically, to have someone with your qualifications with Two Blue Ace say, hey, Orlando, you've got Avon Park Range, you've got local, you got Orlando Executive, you got the Orlando International. How does someone fly across the state with all these airplanes in the air? And
I mean, the FAA has untold numbers of subject matter experts of all certifications and everything. So there's no shortage of aviation experience out there. There definitely is a market for aviators and aerospace experts that have flown both military and general aviation. And in our case, with my brother's experience in commercial aviation, big heavies all over the world. So there's no shortage of expertise, Todd. And so, where is our niche? It's probably in the fact that we've flown all over the world in one seat, one engine airplanes. And the way we mitigated risk in the military, and Kurt and my brother's and Larry's job, we can apply that to the civilian world, and sometimes it comes up with a little more innovation than maybe they get on their own.
so let's say Eli wants to get his pilot's license, and he gets his certification, he gets to solo. He says, I got to go see someone in Vero or Palm Beach. How hard is it for him to navigate Orlando airspace, the
If he's
Avon
a new
Park
guy,
range?
if Eli
would
is,
he never be qualified to do that unless someone
heck
was sitting
yeah.
next to him?
I mean, it would take a good briefing. It would take an iPad that's current so that we could dial up the airspace and look at it and see which altitude we needed to go and what the ground.
but he
track
would
was.
be trained to be able
He'd
to
be
do
trained
that.
to do that, and then when he took off and headed up toward the Orlando airspace, his instructor, if I were his instructor, I'd be crossing my fingers going, Eli, don't let me down, buddy, because this is not easy. It's not routine when you get close to Orlando
Right.
or Miami or Jacksonville. You better know what you're doing, because if you don't, they're going to take your license away.
I trust you as my instructor.
Thank you, Eli. I appreciate that.
So maybe you can take him up, give him a little spin around at a
We'll do
seaplane,
that.
and
Hey, I
do
will
some of
take
that pilot stuff.
I will take anybody up, including Eli, anytime he wants. But, if he wants to learn to fly, I'll probably give him his orientation, and then I'll give him to a younger instructor who is more, I'm not a touchy-feely guy, Eli. If you make a mistake, I'm going to not yell at you, but I'm going to tell you, you don't do that again.
You're more touchy-feely than me, Jim.
We won't go there, Todd.
Hello, everybody. This is Buck McLaughlin. I am the Range Operations Officer for Avon Park Air Force Range. And today I had the great opportunity to be on Todd's podcast. Really encourage everyone to tune in to Todd's podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to it wherever you get your podcasts.
So let's talk about some of the recent events that have happened. We have a plane and a military helicopter that crashed in D.C. a month or so ago. You got the Philly plane that was a Mercy flight, I think, taking the young boy back to Mexico. I think was his destination, but he had taken off and they crashed. The Delta plane flipped over on its back in Canada when they were landing. And you mentioned Lake Hartridge a few years ago. Doors are flying off of planes, wings are rattling, engines are catching on fire. What in the heck is going on in the world of aviation right now? Or does it always happen and we just have an intense media right now that's focusing on it?
I think it could be a little bit of both, honestly. It's just one man's opinion. There's that old adage that these things happen in threes. We may be experiencing that a little bit. There could be issues with perhaps training or material supply or procedural proficiency that could lead to panels flying off or engines not working properly or whatnot. I'm just speculating.
Right, and I know you don't have any inside information you got for us.
But I do think that there are factors, and they really cut across any industry, that could be contributing to these things from happening. It's all tied to the objective of what that entity is trying to accomplish. For example, the helicopter midair with the regional jet outside of Washington, D.C. and going into Reagan Washington National Airport. There could be several factors that contributed to that. It could be a recency of experience, proficiency of experience. What were the training objectives? Because the helicopter flight was a training flight. What were the training objectives for the helicopter? If night vision goggles were involved as part of one of the training objectives for that flight, and the goggles were being worn, what was the scene available to the pilot under NVGs? And what I mean by that is, how much fidelity is the pilot actually able to see within that field of regard, in that field of view? One of the things that happens with night vision goggles, because they basically absorb the ambient light that's out there, amplify it, and that's how it doesn't turn night into day. The only thing that turns night into day is the sun. Okay? But one thing I will say is that if there is a lot of background light over a major city like Washington, D.C., or Crystal City, which is the direction that I think the helicopter crew was looking towards as they were flying their flight path, the image in the goggles could be washed out. In other words, it's almost like if you remember old black and white TVs and you played with contrast and brightness, you could get to the point where the image is washed out and everybody is kind of blending into the background. The actors are blending into the background of the Western that you're watching or whatnot. The same thing happens with night vision goggles in areas where there's a lot of background lighting. And it can get to the point where it makes it, I won't say impossible, but it makes it very challenging to be able to discern what you're trying to look for. So that could be a contributing factor as well, along with proficiency, recency of experience, and then whether or not there are any errors in either ground track, lateral separation, procedural stuff between the airliner traffic going into Washington or the helicopter traffic. It's pretty busy. You'd be surprised around that area because there is all that training that's going on for whether or not it's active duty or Air National Guard helicopters, Army or Air Force. They all kind of fly around the same general vicinity. So those are things, those are variables that the National Transportation Safety Board is going to evaluate to figure out those root causes that we talked about earlier when we were talking about safety investigation boards. What actually happened? How do we prevent that from happening in the future?
Yeah.
If you were still in your old position as the flight director for the Air Force or safety director, would you have been brought in to investigate because there was a military helicopter involved, or if it had been a private helicopter and private entity plane?
If it was
would that have ever?
If it was an Air Force aircraft, rotary wing or fixed wing, then the Air Force safety apparatus would be energized. And like Jake was talking about earlier, they'd send a senior officer. When I say senior officer, a colonel,
Right.
or a brigadier. Typically, a brigadier is brought in when there's a fatality or fatalities to lead that investigative effort.
But you would have had a counterpart in the Army, since it was.
Yeah,
you wouldn't have done all of any aircraft. It would have just been any Air Force.
Air Force aircraft. Yeah, as a matter of fact, a little sidebar. When I was at the Air Force Academy, I did one semester at West Point on exchange, the first semester of our junior year. And as fate would have it, when I was the Air Force Chief of Safety, one of my buddies in Company C4 at West Point, a guy by the name of Tim Edens, who's a retired brigadier, was the Army Chief of Safety the same time I was the Air Force Chief of Safety. And one of the visits that I was able to make was to go to Fort Rucker to visit the Army safety equivalent of what I did at Kirtland Air Force Base and get a sense of, okay, how does the Army do it? And maybe we can kind of take away some of the things that they're doing and incorporate those procedures or techniques as well into our thing.
Is there sufficient collaborative cross pollination between the branches of service? Between the branches of service, or do y'all say, hey, this is an Air Force thing, that's an Army thing, that's a Navy thing? Or do you think they do a decent job of saying, hey, this is what we found, you've got kind of some of the same jets, maybe you need to look at your...
The reports are broadcast out. Certainly the accident investigation board, those are public access.
Okay.
So there can be cross-tell for the accident investigations, and frankly for the safety investigations. There may be information that's truncated in those reports. We used to get, when Jake and I were young captains, we used to get a 2-page recap from the Navy that was written up, all the naval, primarily aircraft mishaps, and what they found out by virtue of their investigations. The interesting thing about that particular document was that whoever was writing it should have been writing for a comedy show, because not only did he cover what happened, but then he would make like editorial comments that, well, a lot of them were hilarious. As far, like I think the Darwin Award thing was actually part of that. I don't know if he's the guy that coined that phrase, but that was the first exposure that I had to that phrase.
A lot of the things in recent events, Todd, those mishaps you talked about can be, distilled down to, well, we were just allowing complacency to creep into our operations there. And that Washington Reagan National helicopter airliner crash, that was just complacency. We had the U.S., the FAA, Washington D.C. had permitted those operations to go on day and night for years. And they would create what they called close pass events. I think they'd have an acronym for them, not the Air Force, but the FAA, CPEs. And there were close pass events day and night, daily, from helicopters to airliners. So when you flew into Reagan National last time, you may have had a helicopter close to you that you never even knew was there, and it didn't hit. Nobody, knew about it. And that complacency is what, kills people. That really does. And the same thing with that accident that happened in Canada where that airplane flipped over. you have crosswinds and bad weather and snow all the time, all around Canada and northern United States. And those conditions really should be handled by the most experienced pilot on the flight deck. And if they're not, that's a mistake. Right. It's a mistake, and in some ways it could be, if not the root cause, it could be a real reason why it happened. If the most inexperienced pilot on the flight deck, there are two, is the one flying into a really bad condition, that doesn't make any sense. And so I think you'll see that come out in the months ahead, that some of these things we were complacent about, cost a lot of people their lives.
One of the things that we talked about earlier is that it kind of goes hand in glove with the complacency thing that Jake was just talking about. But a phrase was coined during another mishap investigation. This was years ago, but the phrase is a culture of assumptions. So what I'm getting at is like, it could be something as cavalier as, well, this is the way we've always done it, and we haven't had any issues yet, so why change it? It's like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of mindset, without kind of thinking through, okay, that's true, but how could we make it better? And in large measure, I think there's a certain amount of friction and resistance and reluctance at times to change up things before there's some event that requires action to be taken. So it's I think it's more natural for people, and I'm saying people with a big P, everybody,
Right.
to take action when forced into, I gotta do something, versus, yeah, we cheated death on this particular near miss, or I prefer to say near hit, but how could we make it better? Because that requires maybe a little bit of extra thought, time, effort, resources, and then the tenacity and the discipline to get the word out at a level that can speak with authority, whether it's the FAA or it's the Air Force or it's the Army or whatnot.
I mean, it could be
in order to make those changes.
It could be that that's what Kurt's doing at Winter Haven Airport, is forcing the airport community and the director to look at the culture of assumptions they've had for years at Winter Haven Gilbert Airport, and to say it's worked okay. We haven't had too many problems. Well, we had a huge problem that you mentioned, with 4 people dying over Lake Hartridge.
Right.
And that culture of assumptions could have been one of the main things that we should have looked at 2 years ago before the accident happened. That's what Kurt's doing with the airport director right now in the process refinement.
What the heck is going on with Boeing? Are they just the whipping boy right now? And I'm not asking to get into something too deep. Is it just a culture that they need to change within the company? Have they just had the string of 3 bad lucks at one time?
I think it's probably a mixed bag of all the above, frankly. I think Boeing they have the lion's share of the market for airliner type aircraft. Airbus is certainly a big player, but in most cases, it's a Boeing product that's on the flight line. If there's been a shift in mindset from excellence in production to consistency of the quarterly report, I think that's probably something that their senior leadership is at least considering to look at, because if your objective is, and obviously Boeing is a big company, their objective is to make money. I get it.
Right.
But by the same token, that can't be the only objective, where everything else drops off to such a noise level, background noise priority, that becomes paramount, because that ends up being an incentive for, I don't want to say bad behavior, but cutting corners or accepting at the wrong, accepting at the wrong level of the organization risk, whatever that risk is, where it's a manufacturing or design or maintenance or whatnot. And so I think those are things that they will probably be forced to look at. It could be a little bit of corporate hubris because they are the 800-pound gorilla in that market. But it's something, it kind of gets along the lines
Could be complacency.
It gets along the lines of that culture of assumptions and complacency, and the organization being forced to take action based on bad news versus it's all good news, but how can we make it better?
Hey everybody, this is your host Todd Dantzler. As most of you know, I'm a partner with Saunders Real Estate and have been a very active and working broker for over 42 years. I have fostered strong relationships throughout the state of Florida, working on properties ranging from agriculture and development land to multifamily, commercial, and industrial projects. If you have any real estate needs at all, please give me a call. I'd love to help. My direct line is 863-877-2846. Thank you. With what's going on with Doge and all these cuts, I want to ask you, I can't imagine cuts. I can't imagine anyone would accept a decrease in safety with these cuts. I don't pay attention to them that closely. Are you guys that fly, are you concerned that, hey, some of these cuts are going to make it a little more difficult for me to take off in Lake Hartridge or fly out to Phoenix?
Todd, the FAA probably needs a good relook.
Trimming?
Yep. And you can tell they do because of their responsiveness. Ask any designated pilot examiner. Ask anybody who's trying to put together, an airport and operating procedures or new remote tower procedures that Bartow and Winter Haven are going to use. Ask about the responsiveness of the FAA, and the answer is they don't even sometimes get back to you. That's not a staffing shortfall often. That is a bureaucracy layer upon layer that absolutely needs to be adjusted.
So y'all still feel comfortable getting in an airplane?
Oh,
flying?
absolutely.
Yeah, the core
absolutely.
elements of what the national airspace is, how it's controlled, those core elements, they aren't firing air traffic controllers. They're getting rid of layers of bureaucracy. I think the same thing is, and you and I visited NOAA, right? And we are big time into hurricane predictions here in Florida. And we know, you and I know the commander out in Lakeland, Shaka, is having to deal with personnel cuts, staff cuts. And maybe they're okay. Maybe he can handle them. But if he's cutting people that are helping with real-time hurricane predictions and forecasting and everything else, that doesn't make sense. That part of DOGE better be thought out properly, or we'll admit it a year from now that they cut into the muscle instead of, getting rid of the bureaucracy.
So the guy that's the National Transportation Secretary, I think Sean Duffy is his name. Yeah. Is it fair to, I don't think so, but he's on the job for 2 or 3 days and he's dealing with planes flipping over. And is it fair to criticize him, or is it the FFA underneath him that needs the trimming or whatever?
Well, I think as the leader of the organization, it's fair to criticize. It goes part and parcel with taking on that responsibility. Do I think he's necessarily accountable for that? I don't. What he's accountable for is to get to the root cause of why these things are happening, and providing the leadership guidance and methodology at the lower levels so that those answers can be brought to bear. But things like this, or issues like this, don't happen at the flip of a switch. They happen, it's very slow. It's a slow fuse.
Degradation.
It's a very slow shifting of mentality. Or one of the things that Jake was talking about was follow through, the challenge and response piece. If you send he used the FAA as an example. Well, we deal with it all the time with when you call the bank, for example, and you want to get some information and they never get back to you.
Right.
Or they keep you on hold for an hour and a half or whatnot. So I think it's a bigger It's a bigger issue than just, it just, these things recently happened and they happened quickly and they're a one-off event. It's a series of compounding errors, I think, that happen over time that have to be sorted through. And as far as the Doge piece, I think I'd be shocked if anybody in the country would be against eliminating fraud, waste, and abuse in any organization,
Right.
whether it's their home budget and how they steward their own money, or how the public's money is stewarded by the people who are in positions of leadership, whether they're elected or appointed. The expectation is the unspoken expectation is that they're going to do the right thing.
Jake, if you got a call from the president that said, Jake, I want you to be my Secretary of Defense, how would you approach waste, fraud, and abuse that's either in the military, or what would you be doing to make the military a stronger fighting force? Or are those the biggest concerns that are out there right now from you guys' perspective?
Yeah, on the one hand, I would say that there are processes in place already that should be working. But if I were given the guidance, double your look, look harder, make sure it's not happening, then I would just prioritize it. It would become the first thing I did in the morning is to review the looks that were being done either at major commands or at unit level, and going, give me examples, show me where there was some waste or some abuse, and if there was fraud, show me that we're getting that guy or gal in jail quickly. Don't delay, and then I would just make that a priority. And the more a commander or a leader of an organization prioritizes something like, let's not have any fraud or waste or abuse, the more you're confident that it's not happening. I think the bigger thing that probably Pete Hegseth and the Secretary of Defense in his office is doing right now is to say, are we really ready? Are our soldiers and our airmen and our sailors and Coast Guardsmen, Marines, are they ready to fight tonight? And in some ways, we're not. And you and Rob and Beef Haddad have had discussions on, are we ready to fight tonight? And maybe the answer is no. And if the answer is no, then there ain't no weekends. There's no holidays. You don't keep track of it.
Got to be the top priority.
It's got to be the top priority.
Absolutely.
Is the United States military ready to fight tonight? And if they're not, then we got work to do. And we start right now. Not tomorrow, not next week, not in June. And I would take the president's tasker to heart. No fraud, waste, and abuse. That's a hard metric to meet. 0.
Right.
There's going to be problems in that area. But readiness, in 6 months, I want to see an uptick in our readiness to fight tonight.
The part of that discussion too has to be similar to the safety privilege thing I mentioned earlier. The focus has to be, I think, on honesty of reporting. And the analogy I'll give you is whether or not a company is motivated by their financial bottom line every quarter or their mission objective for whatever it is they produce. And being honest at that subordinate level and fearless about saying, no, we're not. Here are the reasons why we're not. We don't have enough training time. We don't have the right tools. We don't have enough people. Whatever the issue is, that's exactly what you want from your subordinate leaders,
Right.
is honesty of reporting. And I think there's been disincentives in the past to put a smiley face on what's happening so that we don't get sideways with higher headquarters.
Right. So we got a couple minutes left, and I know you guys are trying to get up in the air in a few minutes. I want to ask you, what are some of the best teams and the best leaders that you guys have ever been around? And if it's a team, like, what were your roles within that team? Who do you sit back and go, I just really had a great experience with this person? they were wonderful to me, and I learned a lot from them.
I would say there are a bunch of examples. The one that first comes to mind for me is when Jake and I were instructors at the fighter weapons school back in the late 80s, early 90s. That was, in my estimation, that was the best team. And it wasn't just our squadron, it was the whole outfit. The quality, the proficiency, the expertise, the presence, and the passion that everyone brought to that organization really raised the bar of performance for everyone. And it could do it in big leaps, or it could do it in very small baby steps, but the bar was always going up.
Was that because of the leadership? They were always moving that bar up?
It was leadership at every level, not just the leadership of the folks that were designated as commanders, but the subordinate leaders as well, because essentially everybody's got a leadership role in that. You can lead just by personal example and presence and your own perseverance and dedication and whatnot. But the Nellis Air Force Base and the Fighter Weapons School, in my experience, that was the best, because the other piece of that is you have all these type A plus long ball hitters in this one organization. Everyone's at the top of their game. Everyone's completely focused on either being the best or becoming the best or learning from the best 24/7. And in spite of what you might see in the movies, there really weren't any egos involved at all. It wasn't there was competition, certainly, but it wasn't in a way where it was a zero-sum game of competition. And that's what made that place so special for me.
And that sounds like a culture of the organization that has to be fostered, it has to be nurtured and promoted.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we're going to have dinner tonight with Dean and Tammy Kendall, right?
Yep.
Our classmate. And Dean and Tammy's son, Jordan Kendall, is at the weapons school, flying fighters in the F-35 right now as we speak. And so what Kurt's going to get a chance to talk to those two parents about is what their son is doing in that operation that he just described, where we were instructors, 25 years ago. I will briefly tell you, Todd, and you know my fondness to the U-2 mission that I was a part of for 3 years, but the 9th Reconnaissance Wing out in California that flies the U-2 all over the world, that was one of the most impressive high-performance teams. We could move U-2s around the globe anywhere we wanted, any day or night. We could then have them a day later, looking at our adversaries, listening to our adversaries, and getting what the president needed to make decisions. And it just took me by surprise when I got there as the commander.
Do you think it was because it was such a smaller organization?
Yeah, it was real lean and agile. Yeah, we weren't
club. You were very tight.
Yeah,
team.
and it was everybody who was there was focused on one thing, and that was making sure the airplane was ready to fly. And we had the pilots in their space suits, and they could go, and they knew how to get where they were going, and they had fuel to get there. And when they landed, some other person would suit up and go fly the mission. It was a pretty cool team, and I still talk about that. I might try and write a book about that.
Good.
My third and last book might be about that leadership at 70,000 feet.
If you could say in one name, who's the leader that you most admired that was instrumental in your career? I know we're up against the hard.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and Kurt and I practiced it on the way over because we got about 50 people apiece that we would say, boy, he or she was a great leader. But the one I would pick would actually not be an Air Force officer. He is a Marine officer. His name's Jim Conway. He's still alive today, and I worked for him in the basement of the Pentagon for 2 years, and it was one of the more absolutely stressful and difficult jobs I had in the Air Force. But he was the director of operations for all the U.S. military around the whole world. And you can imagine how stressful it was. Why was he the best leader? His next job was the commandant of the Marine Corps.
Okay.
and you can tell that quality just follows. It just goes to the toughest jobs. But he was the calmest, most understanding, best listener boss I ever worked for. And the guy, when he was out in the field, had a knife between his teeth. There was nobody you wanted to follow into battle better or more than Jim Conway. So he was it wasn't an Air Force guy, he was a Marine Corps guy, and he was my best boss.
Nubes?
The name that comes to mind for me is a guy by the name of Bryant Gross, who passed away a couple of years ago. Jake and I had some overlap with him in our very first assignment at Nellis when we were lieutenants and whatnot. And he ended up shepherding me through not just my Air Force career, but my time in industry after I retired from the service as well. And when I say shepherd, he didn't just shepherd in a professional manner. He was a warrior's warrior as well, larger than life, filled the room when he walked in. If he spoke, everyone would stop what they were doing to listen to him. But he shepherded me not only in professional ways, but in personal and just like how to be a decent human being. And I used to call him, I told him this before he passed, that he's a warrior poet. And he really was. He's from he was like out of a bad neighborhood in Houston, Texas, and been in a lot of scraps and that kind of stuff. And his face looked like 80 miles of bad road because he's been out in the sun all this time. And he had that Texas twang to him or whatnot. And he had a pretty hot temper. He was a tough guy to work for. He expected and demanded a lot. But at the same time, he was very well read, whether it was history or poetry or biographies or whatnot. And just the total package of this, the dichotomy between this big burly man who was almost like a Renaissance man in his areas of expertise and interest was just priceless as far as what he taught me over the years. So he was the archetype for me.
We're 3 minutes over the time I said I'd get you out of here. Can you give me 30 seconds on Two Blue Aces, what you guys do? If someone wants to get in touch with you, hire you, ask you to help them, what do they do?
Yeah, Todd, as a fellow ace, you being one of us and Nubes as well, just a group of mostly retired general officers. But again, my son I consider an ace. My wife is pretty darn good at running the operation.
She outranks you all.
She outranks all of us, and
Yes.
never forget that. But
I'm
Two
scared
Blue
to death of
Aces
her.
is a really aerospace and defense consulting company, and we can go everywhere for the every level from defense primes all the way down to companies that are trying to do leadership succession training and development. And I would also say we're pretty good at executive coaching, at mentoring, and really the leader development programs that every company and organization needs. So we got a pretty good website, and you can find us TWOBLUEACES.com, twoblueaces.com.
And full disclosure, my company hired you to speak to us at our corporate retreat month and a half ago. Some friends of mine, Andrew and Ramona Barber down in the Fort Lauderdale area, hired Beef to come in and help them with some team building things. So you don't just do military things.
Correct.
It's also done for the
we're
civilian
pretty good
side.
at it
So,
now. We're pretty good at non-military team building and leader development.
guys, can't thank you enough. Thank you, one, for dinner last night. It was very enjoyable, and I hope you enjoy your flight. Major General Jake Polumbo, thank you for your service. Major General Kurt Neubauer, thank you very much for your service. Thank your families for giving and letting y'all do what you do, because people don't seem to understand the stress that your families go through while you guys are off flying planes and having fun and playing golf and doing all the fun stuff. So thank you very much for coming in.
Oh, thanks
Look
for the
forward to it,
opportunity.
and y'all have fun in the air today.
Thanks, Todd.
Will do.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Eli.
Hey everybody, I want to thank you to listening to Todd's podcast. This has been your host, Todd Dantzler. As always, don't forget to rate, review, follow, and subscribe to Todd's podcast on your favorite podcast app. If you have any questions for me or any suggestions for future guests, please call or text our number at 863-288-0944 or visit todddantzler.com. Again, that's 863-288-0944 or visit my website, todddantzler.com. I look forward to hearing your questions and feedback, and please take care.